That 5-chime Nathan whistle ringing around Owasso, Michigan belongs to the most famous steam locomotive that has ever come out of the Pere Marquette Railway. Pere Marquette number 1225 is the steam locomotive that was in the legendary Polar Express written by Chris Van Allsburg and adapted into a movie by Warner Brothers in 2004. However, as much as 1225 is remembered as the steam locomotive that was in the Polar Express, there is much more history to the engine than just the real-life basis for the book and the movie. Her service life has so much more history behind it than most people think, and today, the full history of Pere Marquette number 1225 is told. December 6th, 1941. The Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. Pere Marquette Railway number 1225, a 284 Berkshire steam locomotive, finished construction. She was part of the Pere Marquette's N1 class of Berkshires, the second in line. The first class was the N class. The Berkshire-type steam locomotive had been around since the 1930s and had been the go-to steam locomotive for freight trains in the Midwest and the East Coast of the United States. Railroads like the Nickel Plate Road, Erie, Chesapeake in Ohio, and Louisville and Nashville had all purchased Berkshire locomotives. The Pere Marquette was looking to replace their 282 Mikados with these new locomotives for heavy freight trains. 1225 was $200,000 to construct, and she was delivered to the Pere Marquette Railway that day. 1225 has a length of 101 feet, a width of 10 feet, and a height of 14 feet 6 inches. Like a lot of other Lima graduates, she is a big steamer as the tender weighed 363,400 pounds and the locomotive weighed 442,000 pounds for a total weight of 805,900 pounds. 1225 is a hand-fired coal-burning steam locomotive. Unlike West Coast railroads like the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific railroads, East Coast railroads did not have any big fire dangers where they ran, and they also had coal mines to run their steam locomotives. The coal capacity of 1225 is 44,000 pounds and the water capped at 22,000 gallons. The tractive effort of the engine is 69,300 pounds with a horsepower rating of roughly 3,000. She has a top speed of 70 miles per hour but could go faster. However, her average speed is 50 miles an hour. 1225's whistle is a Nathan 5-chime. The bell of 1225 is a mechanical bell. The day after her delivery, something happened in the Pacific Ocean the next day.
Hello NBC, this is KTU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning a distant view, a great battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed in Hawaii. Although this bombing brought the United States into the war, it also allowed 1225 and various other steam locomotives that were newer off the assembly line to show off their strength. The locomotive was immediately put into service to pull heavy freight trains like wartime materials, general supplies, and scrap metal between Detroit, Grand Rapids, Saginaw, and Flint, Michigan. She also served Toledo, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois. During the war, the Pere Marquette would order another class of Berkshire steam locomotives in 1944. These new Berkshires were built to help the existing Berkshires on heavy freight trains. These engines for the Pere Marquette pulled wartime freight trains until the end of the war in September of 1945. After the war, 1225 and her sisters had more normal jobs like hauling steel and coal deliveries. In 1947, the Pere Marquette and the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad merged. The Pere Marquette name was swallowed up by the C&O as they retained their name. 1225 was re-lettered and almost renumbered. She was supposed to be renumbered to 2659, but the Chesapeake and Ohio chose to keep the number 1225. She continued on in service for many more years until the early 1950s. Much like other steam locomotives built in the 1940s, 1225 had a short service life. While some did last longer in their careers, 1225 and many other steam locomotives of the Midwest were quickly withdrawn from service and replaced by diesel locomotives. Despite 1225's very short service life, the locomotive was retired as early as 1951, 10 years after her construction. Just like that, 1225 was dormant. After that, the engine was then placed in storage at a scrapyard in New Buffalo, Michigan. With 1225 sitting at New Buffalo, her future was uncertain. For 6 years, 1225 sat in storage at the scrapyard while her siblings were cut up and scrapped. However, 1225 had light at the end of the tunnel. In 1955, Michigan State University trustee Forrest Akers, a former vice president of Dodge Motors, was asked by Chesapeake and Ohio chairman Cyrus Eaton if the university wanted a steam locomotive. Mr. Eaton was trying to donate as many as he could to help preserve the history of these engines, but many places either couldn't take them in or didn't want them. The engineering students at the university spoke in support of getting the locomotive to study metalworks and other subjects. Akers thought it was a solid idea and pitched it to university president John Hanna. Forrest Akers and his supporters wanted the locomotive as a monument to the age of steam in the United States. However, Hanna didn't want a steam locomotive along with many others at Michigan State University. But because Akers was a high donor to the university, Hanna begrudgingly accepted the gift. But when he called the dean of the engineering department, he said that the engineering class wasn't interested in the locomotive. Later that year, Hanna called Dr. Roland Baker, the director of Michigan State University's museum, and asked him if he wanted a steam locomotive. Dr. Baker then approved the request. With the decision final, the Chesapeake and Ohio instructed the yardmaster at New Buffalo to cosmetically restore a steam locomotive at the yard. 1225 was the first in line and was chosen. The engine was cosmetically refurbished, and in June of 1957, 1225 was donated to Michigan State University near Spartan Stadium. Sadly though, the locomotive immediately became a target for criticism. Michigan State University publicly said that the Berkshire was an eyesore and did very little with the locomotive. The engine wasn't really welcomed by the university. The only reason that 1225 was there was that the university's top donor wanted the locomotive at the campus. Shortly thereafter, a young Chris Van Allsburg would then go and visit 1225. He lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and at the time, he would go to every single Michigan State football game. 1225 was right in front of Spartan Stadium. Along with Chris, many others would get tours of the locomotive from the university students in the engineering department. From 1957 to 1968, the engine sat dormant. The rain, sun, snow, and the students in the engineering department were the only things that the locomotive saw. As a result, her condition gradually worsened and nothing was being done with the locomotive. MSU had no intention of doing anything else with number 1225. However, the future of the engine would take a much-needed change for the better in 1969. In 1969, the group of engineering students at Michigan State University in charge of giving tours of 1225 formed the Michigan State Railroad Club. Originally, though, the group was just a railfan group with slideshows about trains in the region and engineering students being in charge of tours of the engine. But ideas of 1225 started to change that. Randy Paquet, a student at the university, started to throw around the idea of restoring 1225 in 1970. The idea seemed crazy, as nobody in the engineering department knew anything about steam locomotives, but small talk began to turn into serious conversations, and discussions about the locomotive were repeatedly held throughout the year. This endeavor would be extremely arduous to pull off, as restoring a steam locomotive was something that had only been done a few times with the Reading Ramblers, Grand Trunk Western 5629, and Chicago Burlington and Quincy 4960. All of them were in good enough condition to be restored with very little effort. At that point, Union Pacific 618, based out of Heber City, Utah on the Heber Creeper, was not only the first steam locomotive to be moved out of a public park and put back into operation, but she was also the hardest because she was never in a steam program or sold into private ownership like other locomotives. However, this obstacle didn't stand in the way of the students, and they formed Project 1225, part of the Michigan State Railroad Club in 1971, intending to restore Pere Marquette 1225 to operational condition. Michigan State University surprisingly supported this endeavor, but there was a catch. If the group stopped working on 1225, the university would consider scrapping the locomotive. To hammer in their point, they had a hopper car next to 1225 to put her remains in if the work stopped. With this ultimatum, the students assembled and got to work. But restoring a steam locomotive, let alone a Berkshire, is very complex, and none of the students had any experience in machine work or locomotive science and construction. But the naive students led by the group's president, Chuck Julian, started the project with a single extension cord and various metalworks tools. In November 1972, the boiler was test-fired. Although the engine failed it, the results showed that the flues needed replacement. But immediately, there was a problem. They needed 1225's blueprints. Thankfully, they contacted Kenneth Pelton. He had worked on the Berkshires from the Pere Marquette Railway in the 1930s and the 1940s. For the next 3 years, Pelton donated his time to the restoration of 1225 and got blueprints for the engine's class. Components for the locomotive were next to impossible to find. The group looked at getting parts from Pere Marquette No. 1223 in Grand Haven, Michigan, but the caretakers in charge of maintaining the locomotive and part of the Michigan State Railroad Club objected. After that, parts had to be made from scratch for the engine. After several years of restoration effort, 1225's whistle was blown for the first time in decades in 1975.
On October 5, 1975, the Michigan State University Railroad Club fired up Pere Marquette Berkshire No. 1225 on the MSU campus. This was the culmination of 6 years of work. The 1225 had not known steam for 22 years. After all this silence, it was good to hear her speak again.
The next year passed, and the future looked bright for the engine, but with the restoration of the locomotive nearing completion, a curveball was thrown at the group. In 1977, Chuck Julian met up with Dr. Edgar Harton, the interim president of the university. Julian asked about the locomotive's future. At that point, the students and various other volunteers had fired up the coal burner and the restoration was nearing completion. Harton told Julian that the university wasn't interested in operating or maintaining 1225 on campus, but he did say that the students and others working on the locomotive should form a non-profit. Then, the university would give 1225 to the group without a dime paid. But there was a problem. If the group wanted 1225 to run, they needed to get the locomotive off the campus very quickly. This is because near the university, the Shaw Lane power plant was closing. The significance of the power plant was that there were tracks next to the power plant that were used to move 1225 onto Michigan State University. Those tracks would have been torn up really soon. The tracks were owned by the Chessie System, the successor of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. The railroad had informed the university that it did not want to maintain a switch on the line that was not being used. With no switch, there was simply no need to keep the track. If the club wanted to get the engine off the display track and onto the main line, it needed to be really fast. Dr. Harding gave the Michigan State University Railroad Club permission to attach the display track to the siding and move the engine over to a part of the track next to the campus police station. However, the club was required to provide a bond, remove the fence and all of its belongings from the display site, then tear up the tracks where the engine once stood. They also had to rebuild the sidewalk once the work was completed. Fortunately, Colin Williams of Williams Brothers Asphalt Paving Company out of Iona, Michigan gave the club a surety bond, a dump truck, a front-end loader, and a bulldozer. Club members then ripped up the tracks in front of the engine and used those tracks to rebuild the grade behind the locomotive. The engine was then rolled down the tracks and placed in storage at the nearby University Police Station. Chuck Julian, Dave Jones, an equipment operator from Williams Brothers, and many others volunteered their time and spent the next 3 days with the Williams Brothers equipment restoring the site, including rebuilding a new concrete sidewalk. After 1225 was moved, Dr. Hardin said that the club needed to get 1225 a home really soon. He assigned the Landscape Arts Department head the task of working with Chuck Julian to find a home for the engine. They visited several places, including the Simon Power Plant. However, Ted Simon, the owner of Simon Power Plant, was not willing to give up a siding at Power Plant 65 for the engine. The club would need to build one if it wanted one. Contractors would also need to be hired to build a shelter. The cost ultimately was too much for the group. This set members looking for a new site. Several were looked at. They ultimately got their break from a defunct rival railroad. In 1976, the Ann Arbor Railroad had gone bankrupt, and at the time, the state of Michigan became the owner of its assets. After many discussions with the state of Michigan, arrangements were made for the newly formed Michigan State Trust for Railway Preservation to lease the Owasso Engine Shop in 1978. The engine shop had a lot of equipment that would be useful in restoring the engine. 3 years later, in May 1981, Michigan State University officially donated 1225 to the group. 2 years after that, Pere Marquette 1225 was moved to Owasso, Michigan in February 1983. For the next 2 years, the organization finished up on restoring 1225. Finally, on November 30th, 1985, Pere Marquette Railway No. 1225 moved under her own power for the first time since her retirement in 1951. However, 1225 was not at the Owasso Roundhouse. The Tuscaloosa and Saginaw Bay Railway had shops in Owasso. The actual Owasso engine shops needed some repairs for 1225 to move in. A few years after the move, Pere Marquette Railway No. 1225 took her very first excursion train from Owasso to St. Charles, Michigan. Over the next 2 years, 1225 continued to operate out of Owasso, running on the former Ann Arbor trackage. This was the beginning of her new life as a mainline excursion locomotive. In 1990, 1225 rode the former Pere Marquette main line for the first time in nearly 50 years. "1225 had 2 freight train runs and a test trial to determine if the locomotive was prepared for the National Railway Historical Society convention the next year. That convention was in 1991 in Huntington, West Virginia. Nickel Plate Road No. 765 was also going to the convention. In early August of 1991, 1225 left Owasso and went to Plymouth, Michigan, and then to Lima, Ohio, where she met 765 for the first time. The next day, 1225 and 765 left Plymouth and for 2 days straight headed to Huntington, West Virginia. At Huntington, the other steam locomotive was Norfolk and Western 1218. For several days, all three locomotives put in strong performances, with 1218 hauling the heavy excursion trains and 1225 along with 765 running side by side between Huntington and St. Albans, West Virginia. On August 14th, 1225 headed back to Owasso. The next year in 1992, Canadian National donated machinery to the Michigan State Trust for Railway Preservation. This allowed work on 1225 to continue at a much more efficient rate, but in 1993, 1225 was in for repairs due to its 90 square foot firebox. Jumping ahead to 1995, two major events happened. First, 1225 was officially designated on the National Register of Historic Structures in March of that year. And second, 1225 took several excursion trains between Owasso and Detroit, Michigan. 1225 was supposed to operate excursion trains with Milwaukee Road 261 to Scranton, Pennsylvania for the opening of Steamtown National Historic Park in Scranton, but tunnel clearances blocked 1225 from traveling, so she stayed in Owasso while 261 went to Pennsylvania. The next year in 1996, the group acquired a former Chesapeake and Ohio combine passenger car. Along with that, CN donated a burro crane for the group to repair the tracks they operated on. After a hiatus, 1225 was supposed to return for the Engineer for a Day program. Unfortunately, those plans were cancelled. Although the 20th century ended on a sour note for the group, 1225 was ready to begin a new millennium. In 2000, the Michigan State Trust for Railway Preservation changed its name to the Steam Railroading Institute. That same year, the SRI restarted their Engineer for a Day program with 1225 steamed up in Owasso. Also, the SRI had acquired the new Buffalo turntable to use. The turntable itself was extended to allow 1225 to fit on it. The very next year, 1225 made her very first excursions in the 2000s between Owasso and Mount Pleasant, Michigan. This would mark a period of normalcy for the locomotive. The normal for the engine would be photo charter events and regular excursions on the former Ann Arbor trackage. However, that was until the locomotive got her big break on film for the very first time. In 2002, Warner Brothers talked to the Steam Railroading Institute to measure 1225. The company was given blueprints of 1225 to use in a new CGI animated movie based on Chris Van Allsburg's book, The Polar Express. Chris drew inspiration from 1225 when writing his book many years later. Originally, Warner Brothers wanted the movie to be live action. They planned to have tracks laid in Grand Rapids for several shots and then to have others be shot where tracks already existed in snowy areas. But their idea to have 1225 run through Grand Rapids soon proved to be impossible. Instead, they settled on CGI. While measuring the locomotive, they also used the sounds of steam, chuffing, and many more for the Polar Express with digital microphones. With the blueprints provided by the SRI, work on the movie began. 1225 was heavily inspired, but there were differences during production with the movie. For one, while the real 1225 has a coupler up front, there is no front coupler on the Polar Express. Also, 1225 has a headlight on the outside of the smoke box, while in the movie, the engine had the headlight inside the smoke box door. In addition, the whistle was also different. 1225 has a Nathan 5-chime whistle, but in the movie, the Polar Express uses the Sierra Railway No. 3 Lima 5-chime located in Jamestown, California. The movie's director, Robert Zemeckis, decided to use No. 3's whistle because of past movie shooting. Zemeckis shot the famous Back to the Future franchise, and in the third and final film, Sierra Railway No. 3 was used as Central Pacific No. 131. So Robert decided to use the whistle of the engine he was most familiar with. Back to the movie. With help of Tom Hanks, Edward Deason, and the late Michael Jeter along with Robert Zemeckis, the movie was animated with motion capture. The actors wore suits with little white balls all over their faces and suit. This allowed computers to read body movements and apply them to the movie. This allowed the actors' movements to be much more realistic. Production on the movie lasted from 2000 to 2004. Finally, on November 10, 2004, the Polar Express was released onto the big screen. That same year the movie was released, 1225's tender was repainted as the Polar Express, and she made her first excursion runs as the Polar Express steam locomotive. From that point on, 1225's presence on railroad preservation was more known than ever before. After the success of the Polar Express, 1225 continued to operate on the Tuscaloosa and Saginaw Bay Railway trackage for excursions, photo freights, and of course the Polar Express during the winter. In 2009, 1225's boiler ticket was starting to run out. The SRI knew that it needed money for the impending overhaul. The group's money via donations was mostly used for fuel, insurance, and other costs. They knew that more money was needed to get 1225 back under steam as soon as possible. That big window was Train Festival 2009 in the locomotive's home base of Owasso. Many steam locomotives like Southern Pacific 4449, Little River Railroad No. 110, Flag Coal Company No. 75, Viscose Company No. 6, and the Levitan were slated to come. The plan was to have 1225 operate several excursion trains to raise money for her overhaul. Unfortunately, the locomotive's flues were in such bad shape that running the engine would be more dangerous than practical. As a result, the engine was forced to watch from the roundhouse with Nickel Plate Road 765 taking over excursions for the locomotive. But all wasn't lost. The SRI still tried to make the best of the situation and gave tours of the locomotive, trying to get money for the impending overhaul. After the festival, 1225's flues were temporarily repaired and she made her very last excursions. She ran 2 excursion trips with Nickel Plate Road 765. The 2 events were a wartime photo freight train doubleheader on the Great Lakes Central Railroad, which replaced the Tuscaloosa and Saginaw Bay Railway, and the last one was in October with 1225 and 765 hauling regular excursions. She finished off 2009 with the Polar Express. After her runs with the Polar Express, 1225's boiler certification officially expired. Coupled with firebox sheets needing to be replaced immediately, 1225 was promptly taken out of service for her 1472 FRA overhaul in January of 2010. Train Festival 2009 did provide some money into restoring the engine. The majority of the restoration was completed with volunteer labor along with some smaller and larger donations to get the job done. 1225's boiler was inspected, taken apart, and other components like the firebox, flues, and water glass were also inspected. For 3 years, 1225 sat dormant during her overhaul. $900,000 and an inspection later, Pere Marquette Railway number 1225 was given the green light to run excursion trains again in October of 2013. Just a few months later, the engine hauled her Christmas trains between Owasso and Ashley, Michigan. A year later, 1225 hosted Train Expo 2014 with her cousin Nickel Plate Road 765. Other engines like Little River Railroad No. 1 and No. 110, Flag Coal Company No. 75, Lehigh Valley Coal Company No. 126, Visco's Company No. 6, and the Levitan also showed up. The expo was hosted in Owasso, and like last time, all locomotives put in strong performances running up and down the line. Since then, Pere Marquette No. 1225 has stayed in Owasso hauling excursion trains up and down the tracks where her forever home will be located. Has had a very turbulent history. She was very young when she was retired. She was then donated to a university where some students wanted to see her run again and made that dream come true with a restoration effort. After years of having a respectful excursion career, all that changed when 1225 was the locomotive that Chris Van Allsburg used for the Polar Express. Today, Pere Marquette Railway No. 1225 is one of the most beloved steam locomotives in the United States. However, what do others think of 1225? I asked the Steam Railroading Institute of Owasso why they love the engine. The SRI said, quote, "As a non-profit organization, we couldn't do what we do without all of our amazing volunteers. Some of them are professional railroaders, some hobbyists, and some who just enjoy getting their hands dirty in the back shop. We are very fortunate to still have a few of the original MSU Railroad Club members associated with our organization today. Without them, the 1225 would not be in operation to begin with, and to see them still involved so many years later is a true testament to how special the 1225 is. Our volunteers dedicate their free time in exchange for tireless service hours, continual maintenance work, and long days, but if you ask any one of them, they would do it over again and again just to be able to work with the 1225. That is dedication. Many here at SRI find a special appreciation for the 1225 due to her rich Michigan history and ties to the area. She is a majestic piece of equipment, and many find it hard not to fall in love with her. Pere Marquette No. 1225 is an iconic steam locomotive in the Midwest, and she is also one that will continue staying on the rails for a long time to come. She is the Christmas Day Berkshire.